as Dean Caroli already mentioned, we would now like to launch the Emerging Market Report. And for that, I would like to invite Ravi Murthy to moderate the panel. Ravi Murthy is a University Distinct Professor of International Business and Director, Center for Emerging Markets, Northeastern University. Ravi, please.
Good morning. Great pleasure to be here this morning. Lourdes, thank you for inviting me to participate. I think I have not missed a single one of these since you started it. Lourdes and I go back a long way. I founded and direct the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Next year will be our 15th year. I think this year is your 10th year, 11th year. So we got started a little bit earlier, but I must say, as I've watched Lourdes build EMI, it's really amazing, Lourdes, the number of fronts that you've opened up. Every year there's a new front, like the pitch competition is new this year. There's nothing stale about what Lourdes does, and it's a great inspiration, particularly the things that EMI does for the students. We are trying now to emulate and do more. We're kind of strong on certain areas in research, but on the student front, all the wonderful things you do, plus this report, which Lourdes is going to present momentarily. It's a very ambitious undertaking. When she started, I said, God, what, Lourdes, do you know what you're getting into? How are you going to keep on doing this every year? This is a massive undertaking, usually taken up by international institutions like the UNCTAD or World Bank, which have massive resources. And yet, Lourdes and Anne Miro have maintained this and brought up a report every year. So very eager to look to hear what you have to say this year. There's always something new, interesting. I find it so refreshing to have someone look at the broad picture and give us a sort of a snapshot and update of how the emerging market multinationals have been changing over the years. It's an area in which I've also done some work. So with that, I'm going to invite Lourdes to come up here and share with us her latest findings. Okay, and shall we get them all up here right now? Pietro and Gautam, I think are the only two people in person, right? Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We are waiting for the students from Ithaca who unfortunately cannot enter the island between 7 and 9. So they are about to arrive and that will be very nice. So as Andrew said, we thought we'll do it in person, not in person, hybrid. So I wanted to welcome all of you who are joining online. But the idea was that it's so important to meet again. It's so important to continue the conversation in person, and we wanted to do that. And so thank you all for coming. I know that there are many, many hurdles. And in fact, my colleague and my co-author, Anne Miru, still ESTAs from Europe are not allowed. So UNCTAD, OECD, and my colleague Anne Miru, who is now in Switzerland, were not allowed to come yet. It seems that after Monday, this will go back to normal, and that will be very nice. So as Ravi said, we publish a report every year, and the report is possible not only because Anne and I really work hard, and both of us have been looking at emerging market multinationals for many years, and Ravi and other colleagues have been an inspiration, but also because we have a tremendous team. And I have to mention Daniel Dos Anjos, who is a data analytics guy who is excellent. We have to mention, we have here interns in the summer who are very, very helpful. EMI fellows, Vinita Pachava, who helps us with all the data on M&A that is super complex to download and to move. And yeah, all of you. So again, this is a teamwork, it's not me, it's a teamwork. And also all my conversations with so many companies that, and we have here, for instance, ICBC, that has been a colleague, well, a partner from the very beginning. So thank you very much. So where is, and Anne is here, so from Switzerland. So thank you, Anne, for joining. And where is the PowerPoint, Mark? Please. Yeah, and by the way, Mark has been This has been not easy to organize with so many partners, and Mark has been instrumental to make it possible. Okay? Okay, so we have the PowerPoint. And by the way, so as Andrew mentioned, we started a new theme this year. So this year, EMI went through a major strategic review with the advisory councils, alumni, students, the deans, and Andrew gave time from his busy agenda to help us with the strategic review. And one message, one very strong message was to say that we need to have, we need to educate responsible leaders, ethical leaders. So messages that were coming from ESG, and we needed definitely to incorporate them in the report. And hence, the report now has this very important aspect. And by the way, in this very important subject, what we have done is to work a lot with IFC. Momina Ajasuddin, already 3 years working with you, very grateful. And also Pietro, who also leads these efforts within IFC. Both the emerging markets concept and the ESG concept were born at IFC with also United Nations. So very grateful to have extraordinary partners, and also Gotham was very great to do that. Okay, so and how? Where is the clicker? Okay, thank you. Okay. You do it? Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, so the first part of the report, okay, let me, this, I wanted to wear, I had another mask, but I wanted to, okay, I'm going to wear the other one, sorry. Because this one, I wanted to wear the Cornell mask, but the Cornell mask is falling. Okay, so next one, please. Okay, so in the report we did what we do every year, that is to check how companies from emerging markets, mainly Chinese, are growing and occupying a space that was traditionally occupied by US mainly, and to European companies. Please go ahead. Okay, so the first thing we do every year is to check how the number of Chinese companies compared to US companies. The circle means the total revenues. So in total revenues, still US companies are a little bit bigger, but in numbers, Chinese companies have gone up. Please, next one. Okay, next one. Here we compare GDP with the number of companies, and we see a correlation. So countries that have big companies are countries that are big, and countries that are rich, for instance, Switzerland. And that was the previous slide. Okay, the club of countries with big companies is very small. So only around 20, 22 every year appear, 24 maximum, appear with big companies. In fact, 17 only, I'm saying bad. Yeah, so, so only very few have more than one company in the 500, and mainly are the big countries. But you can see that China has a disproportionate number, so higher number than expected by the GDP and by the GDP per capita. So China has developed in a way that want to foster a very strong private sector. I come from a country, Spain, that was also a developing country, and also Spain focused on developing their own companies, and that way was a way of growing the country. So we both, Anne and I, believe that the private sector is a tremendous pillar of development in any country. So every country that has a very strong private sector will thrive, and that is, again, a virtuous circle that is happening right now in China. Next one. But this year we wanted to check. So yes, the number of Chinese companies has gone up, US a little bit down, but what else? So what was a little bit surprising for us is that all emerging markets have grown, and Anne will show a graph on this, and have grown, but the number of companies from those countries has not grown. So yes, Chinese companies have grown at the expense also of the growth of other emerging market companies that have not grown as much. And here we see that. So the lower line is the companies from other emerging markets outside China. And here you see that the numbers are the same in the last 10 years, while the numbers of Chinese companies grew after the global financial crisis. Move to the next one, please. Yeah, and who else has lost? So Japan and Europe, also the numbers have gone down. From Europe, mainly the UK. So so the number of UK, British big companies has gone down. So everybody else's numbers have gone down. Okay, so the next one, please. Okay, so every year also we do an exercise about international M&A. So Chinese companies have grown in size two ways, greenfield and M&A. But what we see that M&A from China has decreased quite a bit, international M&A, after 2017. For two reasons. One, because countries are looking much more carefully about international acquisitions, not only from China, but from anywhere. And also because China has redirected their efforts to other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, where there are acquisitions, but the size of the acquisition is much less. However, US continues to be the biggest, and we'll see that also in the next slide, please. Yeah, and that's thanks to Vinita prepared this slide. So this, we see that the international, so these are the 10 biggest countries by total M&A, and the biggest one is, of course, US, keeps 36%. And you can see in red that China has gone down, and now this in 2020 was only represented only 5%. Let's move to the next one. Okay, and then also another important thing is the acquisitions from China are very often to acquire a brand. Lenovo is a case in point, and so many others. And we see that the brand strength, they say there is no bad publicity. So Huawei, for instance, that was not that well known before, is one of the biggest brand recognitions. ICBC is probably usually number one, and we have here Helen Ye, Ogilvy, and WPP, they do this exercise, and we follow the exercise. So yes, European brands have gone down, other emerging markets have gone down, US and China has grown in both cases. Next one, please. Okay, so then I'll pass the word to Anne, who will present. We also changed this year, and from E20, we used a number of variables to define E20 countries, and we differentiated China because we believe that China is something different. Anne, please.
Yes, first, good morning to everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I hope that you are hearing me well. So I'll follow up directly on what Lourdes said. Yes, this year we have revisited a group of companies, emerging market firms actually, that we consider every year to analyze or illustrate the emerging market phenomenon. So about 5 years ago, we created what we call the Emerging 20 or the E20, and we have just revisited it. Next slide. So we used a number of criteria, which you can see on the slide. Basically, we eliminated from our consideration those countries which are considered as advanced by the IMF, and also countries with a very small population. And we use as criteria for the remaining countries, the GDP per capita, the share in global trade, and poverty levels. The idea is basically to define a group of economies through which we can see what is happening, and especially the shift in global power, both I would say in economics and politics. That's why we also wanted to have large demographic countries. At the end of the day, on that basis, we established a list of 42 emerging economies. And then we rank them by nominal GDP to end up with our, what we thought would be perhaps a new E20 list. De facto, the list is not very different from what the one before, just one or two countries which left it. Why did we call it E20 plus one? Actually, we took 21 countries because we have China, this mammoth in a way, or this elephant in the room. And there is that question that is China still an emerging economy? And it is true by a number of features, such as the nominal GDP, the second economy in the world, or the huge advances in technology, innovation. I mean, think about space, AI, and so on. It has several features of an advanced economy, not really in a transition mode. But if we look at another perspective, the GDP per capita, or the number of people living on poverty level, they still reach about 400 million or close to 400 million at $5.5 a day. So it's not really, so it's a between, and to highlight the singularity of China, we still include it in the group of our emerging economies, emerging country group, but we single it, and this is a +1 in the equation. Next. So here is our list. We actually discussed yesterday, and we with a number of experts in the area. And basically, it's a list. You will recognize many of those economies that you find in emerging market lists. At the end of the day, we must not forget these are the 21st largest in terms of GDP, and they account for almost half of global GDP. So this always is to emphasize that there is a lot going outside what we used to believe to be the center of economic power. Next. And this, Lourdes mentioned a moment ago, the average, the growth of the region. We also highlight also within the universe of emerging economy, the divergence of the differences between, on the one hand, China, and then on the other hand, not only China, but Asia as a whole, and on the other hand, Africa and Latin America. I won't dwell on this because my time is limited. So next. So the next part of this presentation is devoted to the topic of the conference, the topic of the report. And the more I think about it, I think it's a topic which is going to stay with us for quite a while, even at the research level. Is basically this year, we looked at the issue of ESG, I mean, this famous acronym which stands for environment, social, and governance, and how it features in a context of an emerging market. Next. So we devote in the report, we have a particular chapter who in a way sets the background for more specific issues or examination of questions such as sustainable development, and Piotr Majewski and Gautam Jain, who are on the podium, will talk about it, but also looking at this in a particular regional context, and we have Latin America. So this chapter in the report, in a way, set the background, opening up to the rest, the part, the thematic part of our report. And here, of course, we highlight the fact that basically ESG comes at a time where there was a crucial or a pressing demand for action. We are at the early 2000s. That's where the Millennium Development Goals of the UN were adopted. But there is more than action. There is a need for measurement because you cannot improve what you cannot measure, basically. We also highlight the impetus that the concept got through a number of initiatives, but in particular the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And some people say that ESG is to some extent a quantification of the goal and their indicators. We also highlight the COVID legacy and what it means for the world and the business world. And at the end of the day, okay, we do some sort of a global if you want, assessment. But what the message we wanted to go through is that ESG is definitely progressing in emerging market. And there are a number of illustrations, such as the presence of emerging market firms in major initiatives, such as the UN Global Compact, the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, the principle of responsible investment, and so on. So we pay particular attention to that, as well as changes in ESG policies in emerging market. In itself, this is a huge topic, but things are taking place. So we wanted really to highlight that aspect. And the last part of this particular chapter, and an exercise that we launched, and I think we were perhaps a little brave, I would say. This is the next slide. Basically, we did this quantitative exercise to look at the level of firms and see, we wanted to have an idea of who are the best ESG performance among emerging market firms. From the start, I will say that this is an exercise that is progress, because we were confronted with a number of quantitative and measurement challenges. But I think it's really, it was at the same time very interesting to see how concretely, in the fact, it means that you have or you don't have the necessary data. I'll come back to that very quickly. At the end of the day, and our colleague Daniel Dos Santos was instrumental in the world, could comment later on about that. We took emerging market firms with more than $1 billion in revenue, emerging market firm with an ISIN so that they could be identified. And that was a sample of companies. And on the other side, we look at rating agencies. Initially, we had about 13 or 14 data providers, and we ended up with using 8 of them for a number of reasons that are explained in the report, and I encourage you to read it. At the end of the day, we did an average of these scores, and for each of the company for which we had 3 scores. And our sample, who was 200, more than 200, 2,200 at the beginning, was divided by half, eventually, for basically lack of data. Next slide. So we ranked countries according to the number of companies they have in the top 200. And of course, China here is is number 1. 26 of the companies in this top 200 are Chinese. But what is interesting to say is that in the original sample, the starting one, they were close to 60%. That's already a first observation, which raises question about how Chinese companies are taken into account in major rating agencies. And the other silent feature is South Africa, Brazil, and Thailand, especially South Africa and Thailand, which are very much represented in this ranking at the end with 13 and 12% of the company, while at the beginning, they have a very small presence of company. And what is interesting to see is that these 2 countries are countries where the legal and regulatory framework are comparatively relatively advanced, at least compared to other countries in the group. Next. I will very quickly, basically, I don't want to go much more into the detail because I've exceeded my time, but the issues that I think is really very, very, very important, it's going to be commented upon, is how emerging market firms, how they are taking into account in these by these rating agencies, but also how the problems they are facing as far as reporting or even understanding some of the concept under ESG, because ESG as well as corporate social responsibility sometimes is between quotes an alien concept to emerging market. So this exercise is a work in progress, but it raises a number of issues. And one of them is that for those companies who did not report, basically, how are they going to access international capital and sustainable finance? I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll move now to Pietro from IFC. Maybe you can introduce yourself first, and then the findings of your chapter. And very, very grateful, because at any time in this exercise, we checked with him the validity of our findings, and they helped us. We send our list of the best performers. Is that the best for you? And we kept going back and forth. So very, very grateful for all your help to IFC in general, in particular in this exercise to Pietro. Very, very helpful.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. It's really nice to be here. So my name is Piotr Mazurkiewicz. I'm a Principal Environmental and Social Risk Officer at IFC. I'm not sure how familiar you are with our institution, but it's basically it's a private arm of the World Bank Group. We primarily or exclusively invest in commercial private companies in emerging markets. And in fact, everything we do is subject to our sustainability policy, and each individual deal that we invest in is subject to environmental, social, and governance screening. So I'm one of. Let me just step back. In fact, it is so important for the institution that these days we have two different environmental and social departments. So there is a department that is part of the business processing, and there is a department which I'm part of that looks at policy and risks. So basically, this is like a second line of defense. So we look at what the business do, then we see whether, for example, proposed investment, whether the structure of the investment and proposed environmental and social and governance mitigants match the structure, and whether there is a reasonable approach to manage environmental and social risks on one side, and then we also, of course, look at upside and opportunities. What the project would bring to society, to particular country, communities from the environmental and social perspective. So Lauters asked me to look at the key challenges that we face while investing in emerging markets. And I would say that there are a couple of very obvious, like the quality of local laws and enforcement of those laws. Yes, this is quite obvious. There are issues related to development or quality of local capital markets. Political stability, of course. There is cost associated with implementation of environmental and social or governance initiatives. There is the issue related with capacity, and this is amazing because you look at Brazil and you look at Indonesia. Those two countries, if you purely from the GDP perspective, number of the size of population, very similar. But if you look at their capacity from the ENS perspective, completely different. When I go to Brazil, I usually have well-educated partners to discuss about environmental and social issues. When I go to Indonesia, it's a completely different story. So, capacity is very important. Another thing is, the fact that in smaller emerging markets, there is usually very limited number of bankable deals, or there is a limited selectivity. So what you can do there, yes. So for example, from the local bank perspective, to implement sound environmental and social and governance process, or integrate ESG in their decision-making process is quite difficult, because they have a very often very limited number of bankable projects. And at the end, they need to pay their bills. Yes, so sometimes you think that they would follow a certain type of process. They would follow agreements with IFC, for example, but the reality is much more challenging. But given that I have just a few minutes, I wanted to focus on something else, and this is related to availability and quality of ESG data. And this is particularly important from the perspective of capital market transactions. So when the investment decision is primarily based on publicly available information. So it's what's disclosed in the circular, what's disclosed in prospectus. But if you look at the current environment, that I know Dean Carly mentioned about the IFRS, which is a great step ahead. We see a lot of improvement in the EU with the new EU taxonomy on green and social. We look at UN stock exchange initiatives and things like that. But the reality is that this space is extremely messy. It's chaotic. And there are, at this point, no commonly accepted blueprints for disclosure of ESG data. And I can give you an example, again, a practical example from my daily work. When we were interested in investing in a fund that would be then investing in fixed income assets, green bonds, issued by financial institutions in emerging markets. So 2 layers of ENS risk management at the asset management level, and then at the FI level, the issuer level. And of course, they would be investing in capital markets. So then the question is, what kind of data they would be able to obtain to make their decisions, investment decisions. And the idea behind the fund was that it would be ESG friendly, ESG focused fund. We were talking about green bonds. And I spoke to the fund manager. It's the biggest fund or asset manager in Europe. And I look at their methodology, and it's amazing. I mean, to get some sense of the ESG performance of a particular issuer, they are collecting data from 11 independent ESG data providers, 11, because each of them reports on something else. And of course, the coverage between developed and developing countries, it's a question. Then there's the question of methodologies that cannot be, they are not comparable. So to get to some kind of reasonable decision, they need to look at all of these, then recalculate the scores, come up with their own score, and then make the decision. So this is the space that really needs to be sorted out. I think that if going forward, if we are serious about integrating ESG and moving from billions to trillions, and this is something that we discuss at IFC, this data needs to be standardized. It needs to be relatively easily available, and it needs to be of good quality. Otherwise, making sound decisions is very difficult. And the reality is that very often we are talking about greenwashing. So there is a lot of talk about ESG, but in reality, either the asset managers, fund managers, banking institutions are unable to do it because of lack of data, or of course sometimes they just don't want to do it. But let me stop there, and then I would be happy to answer any questions later in the session.
I think I have a presentation, so if you can get the slides up. If you can go to the first slide. The chapter I wrote was on green bonds, essentially from the perspective of emerging markets. Essentially, green bonds have become very popular in the last few years, as you can see from the chart, from the growth of the market. And Dean Kennedy referred to COP26. One of the hairy issues that came out there was how to finance the transition to clean energy. Green bonds, in theory, provide one of the better ways to finance this transition. The reason is, and Pietro just mentioned, the greenwashing risk. The reason for their popularity is, in general, the proceeds for these bonds are supposed to be targeted to specific climate sustainability projects. And the issuer is supposed to get second-party reviews. He's supposed to get audits and third-party certifications, all to reduce the greenwashing risk. It does not eliminate it, but it reduces it. And that's why these bonds have become very popular. If you look at the chart, essentially 1.5 trillion of bonds have issued primarily in the last 5 years. This year through September, already 400 billion were issued. And if you look at the last 5 years, the issuance growth has been about 30% per annum. So it's a very rapidly growing market. You can turn to the next slide, please. As spectacular as the growth has been of this market, emerging markets are essentially missing out, is what comes out of it. If you look at the left chart, the left pie, outside of China, EM countries have issued 12% of the total bonds that are outstanding. It is even more extreme when you look at EM bonds, green bonds in local currencies. There, if you exclude developed market currencies and renminbi, essentially it's 3% of the total issuance. So what that means is whatever little issuance that came out of emerging markets, almost all of it was in dollars and euros, which essentially creates another problem. So you're trying to address climate change problem, but you're creating an external debt problem. So that's something to keep in mind. If you turn to the next slide, please. Now, why is it important for emerging markets to be to essentially make up a bigger portion of green bond issuance? Essentially, this chart shows the additional days with temperatures above 35 degrees centigrade or 95 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century under two different scenarios of greenhouse emissions. And as you can see in both scenarios, one is a very extreme scenario, which is RCP 8.5, which essentially assumes, these are by the scenarios from UN's IPCC. It assumes that emissions do not peak throughout the century. And RCP 4.5 is an intermediate scenario which seems more realistic and in line with COP26, where emissions essentially peak in 2040. In both scenarios, what you notice here is emerging markets will bear the brunt of climate change. So the additional days with heat above 35 degrees centigrade will be the most extreme in emerging markets. And already, these are countries already which have many days above this temperature currently. So you add, these are adding to it. So if you turn to the next slide, please. So how, what is the problem and how can we address this problem? One of the big issues is because of these sort of the requirements for green bonds, there's a perceived or a perception of high cost related to meeting these requirements. Then there's obviously an education issue in the sense there's a lack of awareness of the green bond benefits. Then many of these emerging market countries have underdeveloped or illiquid domestic markets. It's not easy for foreign investors to access these markets. And finally, there are few indices or rating agencies who cover these bonds. So all of these issues sort of create a vicious cycle where it's hard to get out of that. So I had a few suggestions on how to address at least some, or at least part of these problems. And the main thing would be to obviously educate, make an effort to educate these countries. There is an implicit cost benefit when you issue green bonds. Typically, green bonds trade through conventional bonds, so there is cost savings. Not all the time, but in general, there is. So there is, the cost is not as prohibitive as it may seem. The other thing could be to directly address the cost issue by having more sort of structures where cost kind of coupons kind of drop as the conditions for projects are met. You could also get around the issue of domestic markets by issuing bonds. And this was done in many countries 15, 20 years ago in big countries like Brazil, which when they did not have developed local markets, was to issue global bonds denominated in local currencies, but which settled in dollars via Euroclear or Clearstream. So which made it easy for foreigners to access these markets. In terms of the indices, this is sort of a chicken and egg problem. Until the size is big enough, it's hard for indices to grow. But once they grow, it becomes a virtuous cycle. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have our partners who are joining with a video. Is Mark, the videos are working? So please.
Lourdes and distinguished participants, I'm pleased to participate again in your annual conference on behalf of the OECD Development Center and its Emerging Markets Network, what we call EMNET. It is also a pleasure to continue the partnership between our institutions and have the opportunity to share with you some perspectives from our chapter in the EMI annual report on path to progress for business and sustainability in emerging markets. EMLET identified 3 key drivers of the post-COVID-19 recovery for business: digital transformation, green economy, and sustainability. Allow me therefore to dive deeper into sustainability, which is the topic of today's conference and of the EMI report. Our analysis shows that many multinationals operating across emerging markets understand the importance of placing sustainability at the core of their corporate strategies. Environmental, social, and governance criteria, commonly known as ESG, can be leveraged to attract investment, create new business opportunities, and increase global competitiveness. ESG and sustainable finance, including green and sustainable bonds, are gaining traction, even in the wake of the economic crisis. In recent years, investors and financial intermediaries are increasingly factoring ESG assessments into investment decisions, and many businesses are now ESG ranked. As of 2021, the number of signatories of the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, an instrument that calls for the integration of ESG factors, has grown to over 3,400 plus managing participants, managing over 121 trillion of US dollars in assets. Globally, almost $1 trillion of assets were held in sustainable funds at the end of 2019, an increase of more than 30% compared to 2016. Despite this trend,
I'm really sorry, but we are really bad with time. So very quickly, this year we have a new partner that is the Inter-American Development Bank. Bernardo Guillamon has sent also a quick video, but we will put all the videos in YouTube for all of us to see. But unfortunately, we are very, very late with the timing. So very quickly, if you can just say hi from Bernardo, and then we'll move to the next panel. Sorry about that, and we hope that the bus from Ithaca will be arriving very shortly.
Hello, my name is Veneta Andonova, and together with my colleague Juana Garcia and extraordinary research assistant Juan Pablo Borda, the 3 of us from Universidad Los Andes School of Management in Colombia, we worked together on a research project titled the ESG Endeavors and the Opportunities for Latin America that is part of the EMI annual report. I will very briefly summarize the insights, and I hope you will read the full text. So we argue that companies have been implementing multiple approaches towards achieving a new balance between their financial, environmental, and societal objectives. And in Latin America, companies have additional responsibilities in this domain, given the massive biodiversity or richness that companies need to protect for the well-being of the whole planet. And on the top of that, there are the burning social needs across the region. So Latin America presents a fascinating case study regarding ESG. Most Latin American economies are squeezed in the middle income trap that is characterized by an apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, economic stagnation, and on the other, relatively good theoretical prospects for economic growth. In such circumstances, ESG initiatives can be an engine for innovation that circumvent the long-standing institutional and societal gaps and put Latin American societies on a speedier lane for achieving progress and well-being. Now, unfortunately, in Latin America, lack of data and standardized reporting tools frequently lead to fragmented and only partial information on company involvement with ESG dimensions. Large Latin American multinationals that are recognized for their key role along ESG dimensions are included in the Dow Jones Sustainability Emerging Market Index and are well known. And among them are, for example, Bancolombia in banking, Natura in households and personal products, Nutresa in food, beverages and tobacco, Sura in insurance and finance and so forth. However, as of November 2020, the only 4 Latin American nations that have their multinational represented in the index were Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, only 4 of them. Now, in this chapter, we of course look at the available data, in particular a family of Standard & Poor's ESG funds, and try to compare and say something about the performance of the Latin American corporations. What do the results show? So first, what we saw after the launch of the Standard & Poor's ESG Index in 2019, the Latin American index outperformed all other emerging industries by really a significant margin. However, when the COVID-19 crisis hit, Latin American indices were hit the hardest. The performance of these indices has not yet recovered to their initial levels from May 2019. And the most recent performance of the regional indices show a more optimistic state of affairs for both Latin America and the African Middle East indices. Second, what we did in the chapter was to disentangle the Latin American index performance into the country components. And in this way, we could see the between country variations in essentially the heterogeneity of the ESG phenomena, which we think is an important observation. So in this regard, Chile and Colombia show the weakest performance among all 5 countries in the Latin America ESG index. Arguably, this is due to the systemic risks related to the social protest and the long-lasting strikes experienced by both countries during most of the last year. Peru has also average performance, but with only 3 companies included in the Peruvian index, it's very difficult to draw country-specific conclusions. And the best performers are the largest economies of the region. These are Mexico and Brazil, with positive returns for all observation windows, except for the period immediately after the initial COVID-19 impact. And in the end, we also look at the Standard & Poor's Latin American Emerging Large Mid-Cap ESG Index, where we analyze the performance per industry. And the weighted averages based on the market cap of each company involved in the ESG within the industry was used to assess the approximate performance of the industry as represented in the ESG. Now, somewhat surprisingly, we see manufacturing and mining as the best performance during the observation period. Strong peaks after the initial shock of COVID-19 pandemic are evident. They're followed by the retail. Telecoms also have positive returns. And at the end, we see industries that were very hard hit, such as insurance, finance, and oil and gas. They have not recovered fully yet. I hope you enjoy this summary of our research, and hopefully you will go back to the full-fledged document of the EMA report and read the research on ESG in Latin America.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. My name is Bernardo Guillamón. I am the manager of the Office of Outreach and Partnerships at the Inter-American Development Bank, or the IDB. For those of you unfamiliar with the IDB, we are a multilateral development bank dedicated to improving lives in Latin America and the Caribbean region. Through financial and technical support, we help our 26 board member countries. We work to reduce poverty and inequality and advance progress in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. The team I lead at the Office of Outreach and Partnerships enriches this work by mobilizing financing, knowledge, and innovation from a global partnership network of more than 500 partners. And they help us to fill the gap in the support we provide in the region, bring to the table novel solutions, and complement the expertise and strengths of the IDB with their own. At the IDB, we believe partnerships are key for development. Though partnerships have long been the central work of the IDB, COVID-19 underscored the idea that we cannot confront the leading challenges of our time alone. This is both because the global nature of challenges we face, pandemics, climate change, and economic crisis, do not recognize geographical borders, but also because of their sheer magnitude. In particular, a private sector that takes ownership over the region's well-being will be essential. This is because Latin America and the Caribbean has been receiving a diminishing share of official development assistance from the global public sector for years. because governments and traditional development funders around the world face limited budgets and competing priorities, and because the sheer wealth of resources of the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean alone, a region that faces annual SDG gaps numbering the billions, commercial banks, pension funds, family offices, insurance funds, and institutional investors are estimated to have $4.2 trillion in excess capital. With this in mind, we are doing our part to mobilize the private sector to action and to serve as a co-investor and a provider of financial and knowledge tools for those looking to work in emerging markets and improve their performance along SDG lines. So, what is the IDB doing in this space? And what do we offer to those seeking to work ESG matters in Latin America and the Caribbean? First, we are promoting good corporate citizenship, or the practice of strong ESG standards and commitments to address sustainable development through companies' operations. A key initiative in this space is Index Americas, the IDB Group's Corporate Sustainability Index. It is the first index in the world developed by a multilateral development bank, and is the first in the region to be fully aligned with Sustainable Development Goals. And it recognizes performance of companies operating in Latin America and the Caribbean along ESG lines and in terms of their contributions to sustainable development. Second, mainstreaming sustainability and ESG standards to provide benchmark for strong performance and raise the bar to firms. To this end, the unique proprietary IDB Group methodology developed for Index America has been a critical tool. It has been used to develop multiple editions of the Top 100 Index, which recognizes the 100 global firms that are best performing along these lines. It also has developed several iterations of the Multi-Latinas Index, which assess how companies homegrown in Latin America can do along in these indicators. And importantly, through these efforts, it standardizes the metrics of companies operating in the region and provides a blueprint for strong performance. Third, we provide capacity building and knowledge support to relevant players, to local capital markets to encourage sustainability. Beyond developing its own indexes, Index America has been a hard work that, with stock exchanges in the region. We have been collaborating with partners in Argentina, in Mexico, to develop national level indexes based on Index America's methodology. And through these efforts, we have noted that multi-Latinas are actually more active than international firms on sustainability, as many are taking leadership in establishing sustainability goals, policies, analyzing their impact, and training employees and providers to ensure their supply chains operate in development-friendly ways. Fourth, we provide partnership services to companies seeking to align their operations with development indicators and ESG standards. For instance, we are collaborating with global consumer goods like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Danone, InBev, Mars, Postobon, and many others to enhance their sustainability in the distribution networks and supply chains. And through the Private Sector Partners Coalition, an historic alliance of more than 160 partners launched by our president, Mauricio Claver-Carón, earlier this year, we're providing private firms a platform for generating development impact in the region. Last but not least, we co-invest with funds and investors that seek investment opportunities aligned to ESG indicators and the Sustainable Development Goals. For this, we have an exciting new tool, the Sdg Financial Toolkit. The toolkit provides private investors with a distance-to-target analysis that assess investment opportunities across different sectors with potential to close SDG gaps. And it covers 10 different sectors and 31 project types, and it is aligned with the IDB's strategy. We have been working for more than 3 years with our partners at the United Nations Sustainable Development Network Solutions on this tool. And we will formally be launching it soon so that investors and co-financiers can utilize it to inform their investment decisions. In all the work we do, there is room for collaboration. And indeed, collaboration is at the heart of our novel Vision 2025 Reinvesting the Americas agenda, which outlines 5 key investment opportunities that have the best potential for sparking recovery and economic growth in the region. We invite you to join us to find opportunities to engage with IDB, to spark recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean, and to work with us as we harness the private sector as the force for good in emerging markets. Thank you very much.